Hey, this is Jim Fedor. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition Channel. And hello again to all my friends and listeners out there. You got Jim here. We're about to embark on another study in a story about Jesus. And I love these stories because I'm teaching them to you in what I refer to them as their proper context. And I got this information a few years ago from a man named Doug Greenwald. And look, I'm 68 years old now. Been doing this for 10 years, and I still learn new things every day. And one of the things I learned a couple of years ago from Doug Greenwald, who's since passed away, unfortunately, he was really an engaging fellow. But one of the things I learned was that because of the English language and the translation, there's a lot lost because of that. Somehow the Hebrew text is able to put certain situations in proper context. And in order to do that, Mr. Greenwald taught me that if you go back to the time of Jesus, even before, many of the scholars, many of the scribes, many of the prophets spoke in what is referred to as remez. Now, the use of remez in Jewish literature was used by all the gospel writers. Luke used it more than 24 times just in the first chapter of his gospel, when he speaks of Mary's Magnificat, Zechariah's Benedictus. They are a cascade of remez. Jesus's actions in the first century, any observant Jew would understand what his remez was. It could be a physical phenomenon, as I said. It could be a phrase. It could be a word. It could be actions. So Jesus walks on water in Matthew's gospel, and that evokes a remez back to Job 9:8. When Jesus knelt down and wrote in the sand, remember in the movie Passion of the Christ? When he bent down and you saw that finger writing in the sand? It was the story of the woman who was caught in adultery, right? So the remez, people in that era, in that area, during that time, would understand that as a remez, referring back to Jeremiah 17:13, where Jeremiah 17:13 says, "Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust." How about when Jesus brings back the son, the dead son of the widow Nain? That was a remez back to Elisha, who basically did the same thing in essentially the same place with the Shunammite woman, riding a donkey in the Kidron Valley from Bethpage on Palm Sunday. Would have been understood by many in the crowd that day as a double remez back to Zechariah 9:9. So if you understand that a lot of the writing and a lot of the speaking back there in the first century was done in remez, it'll go a long way to you better understanding what's going on in just about every Bible story. So today I'm going to relate a story very similar to the one I did about Elizabeth and Zechariah. Matter of fact, the first part of this concerns Elizabeth and Zechariah. I think I told you in my first teaching about them that the name Elizabeth means one who swears by God. Elizabeth, married to Zechariah, was born into a priestly family. She carried the name of Aaron's second wife. Remember, Aaron was the brother of Moses and was Israel's first chief priest. So her father betrothed her to Zechariah, the son of another Levitical priest. So it's a priestly family. The Semitic meaning of his name is whom Jehovah remembers, if you remember the story that I told you. And that name goes back 500 years into the prophetic time of Jesus. Back when Abraham got the covenant. So when they got married, I'm sure there were very high expectations for that marriage. Two priestly families coming together, the prodigy's got to be extraordinary, right? And what happened? In Luke 1, 6, and 7, you provided a unexpected summary of the first 30 years of their life, where it says both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all of God's commandments and regulations blamelessly, but they had no children because Elizabeth was barren and they were both well on in years. So here's Luke, this doctor, this writer, this historian, brilliant mind, and with an incredible economy of words, explains the disappointment, the pain, the hurt, the frustration, the misunderstanding, the self-doubt. And he explains it in one sentence with the word barren. B-A-R-R-E-N. And to first century Jews, this is inconceivable. It just doesn't make any sense. Two righteous families, two godly families, two priestly families coming together, and in their religious world back then, this is all supposed to work out. To be upright in God's sight and yet barren all those years was incomprehensible to decent Jews, good Jews. It was totally outside of a devout Jew's mindset. God just doesn't bless people that way. That is a curse, folks. And that's what Elizabeth and Zechariah had to go through for those 30 years. Man, think about what it was like for Elizabeth to be barren for 30 years. I mean, this woman is doing right in God's sight, but her religious culture said she must be doing something wrong. Year after year, her sense of inadequacy could only increase, right? After all, it was a given that procreation was God-given. It was the whole identity of a woman, the whole purpose of a woman. And being married and being a mother was the fulfillment of it. And then decade after decade after decade, her sense of social rejection and cultural humiliation with her extended family probably threw her into a deep sense of perpetual shame. I mean, in her own words, Elizabeth acknowledged that my disgrace among the people, right? Her words are translated as the shame that I have suffered. Not only did she live with a chronic sense of feeling misunderstood, but most likely powerless also, right? Fully realizing there's nothing she can do about it in an earthly human sense. And one thing was really clear to Elizabeth's clan and community. She was childless. Now she's old. So she's not going to have any children. And there's only one conclusion those people back then could come to. Although Elizabeth appeared to be righteous, appeared to do the right things, she had to have offended God in some way. And now she's being punished. Our religious mindsets, those frameworks in which we think, process, and judge, can also inflict pain in the lives of those who don't conform to our understanding of how we think things should be today. Right? Back in the 60s, 70s, it was thought of, if you were a homosexual, that, you were put off in a certain category. Today it's accepted. Men are marrying men, women are marrying women. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's, moral, the mores of a society have changed. But back then, she was a social leper. That dogmatic perspective that was taught by a lot of the rabbis there were only two conditions for which God was performing a chastening, if you will, on people. One of them was childlessness, and the other was leprosy. If you had leprosy, you somehow sinned against God. If you were childless, you somehow sinned against God. Can you imagine how painful that perspective must have been to her psyche? I mean, these two people were Levites. Levi, the tribe of priests. And to be branded as social and religious lepers by their clan, their tribe. But they are faithful, man. They just keep on praying. They prayed even when they began to wonder what it all meant. Even when they lost all hope, they continued to pray, even when they were weary and heavy with waiting. They prayed when they didn't feel like praying. Man, it just had to be utterly disastrous for those folks. Everyone's waiting for them to produce a baby, and nothing happens. Nothing. And Luke's reflection on this, in Luke 1:25, when she says, "The Lord has done this for me," she said, "in these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." Why? Well, after all those years, he finally produces a child for them. How did they wait all those years? Luke tells us that they waited blamelessly. They faithfully kept on keeping on, even when there seemed to be no reason to do so. And you know how many times Elizabeth must have reflected on the meaning of her husband's name, whom Jehovah remembers? That's what Zechariah means. And she had to ponder the irony of that meaning, especially when it seemed as if God had forgotten those two guys. Man, what an inspiration they are to keep on keeping on when life doesn't go in the direction you wished and with the desired outcomes that you hope for. Man, I just look at my son and the guys down there at the Market Street Mission in Morristown, New Jersey, and this story brings those guys to mind for me. You think any of those guys, when they were growing up, thought that they'd be drug addicts or alcoholics or, try to commit suicide? Man. So these two people, after years of waiting, there had to be times of soul searching and self-doubt. I'm sure Luke gives us no clues that the answer ever came to their why questions, the seeming silence of God, yet they remained faithful, praying all the time, walking blamelessly, never allowing their shared sense of being passed over to degenerate into despair. They never permitted their profound sense of unfulfilled longing and discouragement to paralyze them like it does others. And all the while, this couple's shared sense of unfulfilled longings for a child went deeper and deeper and deeper into the marrow of their soul. And then 30 or 40 years after they were married, Zechariah comes home from serving in the temple, and God tells him they're going to have a kid. And he can't even speak. So when he finally gets home to Elizabeth, he has to figure out a way to tell her that they're going to have a baby. And somehow she pieces that story together, right? Which is why in Luke 1:5, she actually said, "The Lord has done this for me. In these days he has shown favor and taken away my disgrace." Even though she's now going to have a baby or is pregnant at a time when, most women are 20 years past their ability to have a baby. But God's ways are not our ways. Just look at Abraham and Sarai, or Sarah. I mean, he was 100 and she was 90. God's ways are so different from ours. Although Zechariah now can't speak because of what happened to him in the temple, everybody's talking about it. And just think back there. That would be big news in the temple area, that this priest and his wife, after years and decades of being barren, are going to have a baby. And somehow he's not able to speak. That's the big news. That would be front page on any newspaper back then in those times. Her pregnancy, I'm sure, was publicly discussed. Her longing for a child is resulting in, if you will, to steal a New Testament phrase, it was her fullness of time. And because of that, she's been rescued from humiliation, from social rejection. She's rescued as a social leper. Nothing is impossible with God. And that becomes a recurrent theme in the heart of Elizabeth. Her son is going to prepare the way of the Lord. The way Luke tells it, not only does the Lord remember Zechariah and Elizabeth, but he rescues them and honors their decades of righteous waiting. And in the process of being released from her cultural disgrace, she not only is restored to social acceptance in her clan and tribe, but she's lifted up to an honored position within the clan. She's repositioned from being on the outside looking in to being on the inside looking out. From being marginalized and excluded to being the epicenter of inclusion. What a reversal, huh? And because of Zechariah's visitation in the temple, it's now clear to all the people in the tribe that something special is going on in Elizabeth's belly, in her womb. And I'm sure for years to come, people are talking about her son's birth, and later on, as an adult, his preparing the way for the ministry of the Messiah. Listen, you have no idea how important that is to a good Jew back in those days. Everyone was praying, everyone was waiting in anticipation for the prophesied Messiah. So, putting God's incredible surprise in this narrative, Luke goes from Elizabeth and Zechariah, and he shifts his focus from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north. from senior citizen Elizabeth in the South to a 12-and-a-half-year-old girl about to become a woman named Mary. And as Luke continues to unfold this narrative, in verses 26 through 38, he actually contrasts the two wombs. One long closed and another yet to open. Intertwining two wombs, not tombs, intertwining wombs in God's eternal plan. The message that the angel brought Mary in chapter 131 was not initially good news for everybody. From Mary's perspective, becoming pregnant while betrothed could mean death by stoning. That can't be good. Her best case scenario would be a perpetual stigma resulting in a non-married status. Who would ever want to marry her again for the rest of her days? Knowing how things worked in her culture, and I did a lot of research on this when I wrote my book, Change of Heart, Mary knew all her hopes and dreams were dashed, or would be dashed. Her hopes for an ordinary life, her hopes for an uneventful life, were gone. In that worldview, the thing most likely to happen now would be for Joseph to go back to a scribe, undo the betrothal contract, and produce a writ of divorce. As a result, she'd never have a husband and no security for the rest of her life. Furthermore, in that devoutly religious culture of Nazareth, her son would forever be known as a bastard, as an illegitimate son of Mary. And Mary knew that her life would change forever without the interceding of our God. And knowing that these perceptions would be part of Mary's social and cultural reality going forward, God encouraged her. He had that angel come, inform Mary that Elizabeth, in her old age, was also a child. She's way up north. Elizabeth's way down south. And Mary would totally understand Elizabeth's plight of years of disgrace and humiliation. Mary, of course, understood the miracle of Elizabeth's pregnancy. Just to make sure that the meaning of Elizabeth's newly opened womb is not lost on Mary, God had that angel reinforce the meaning by declaring, "For nothing is impossible with God." Mary suddenly started to sense the inherent shame issues of her new situation, and she had to be comforted by this gracious glimpse into Elizabeth's new reality. Luke goes further in his next verse, providing us with an insight into the impact of Elizabeth's newly announced pregnancy upon Mary. Mary replies in the spirit of submission and faith to the angel by declaring, "I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said." She totally gives in. And with that response, this wonderful portrayal by Luke, Mary is the measuring rod of submission for a disciple. With Mary, faith is not just an intellectual proposition. It's a verb. It's a verb that's lived out in submission to God's will and God's way. A submission lived out even when every cultural fiber of her being feels that this is not in her best interest. Right? You think about it. Think about if it happened to you as a woman. How would you feel? In Luke chapter 1, verse 39 through 45, it says, "At that time Mary got ready and hurried a town in the hill of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth." So she went to visit her. It says, "When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb." That's John the Baptist. "And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she explained or exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that what the Lord has said to her will be accomplished." Wow. These verses, an anointed encounter of the two women whose wombs are suddenly entwined together. The barrenness question from Elizabeth that's long been part of her life. God gives her new perspective by allowing her to look back through the rearview mirror and see why she was barren for all those years. Now she's starting to understand the context, right? They had to wait for Mary to be born and then come to childbearing age. Just think about it. So now at long last, all these pieces of the puzzle are coming together. They're starting to fall into place. Unlike many of our desires, their longing for a son or an heir were always rooted in God's plan for them. All of those years of being misunderstood, Elizabeth, of feeling disgraced, of not knowing, get anointed with the beauty of God's purpose and meaning. They begin to understand it. Her decades of waiting, that longing, were intentional in God's hands. Of course, you don't understand it at the time. I just look at what my son is going through now versus what he went through, a few years back, and things are starting to fall into place. Everybody's starting to get a realization of what God's plan actually was. His journey, his pain, his anguish served a purpose. It served his purpose. It revealed his glory. Elizabeth and Zechariah's courage and commitment to persist in their faith is now strengthened with the added realization that God was at work all the time. They just didn't know it, and they couldn't see it. I'm sure my son Ryan didn't know it at the time. I'm sure the other guys at the Market Street Mission who made it through didn't know at the time what God's plan was for them. He was at work at a higher level with a higher purpose that nobody could imagine. You think I ever thought I would be teaching the Bible in the year 2000? I had just sold my car dealerships. I was set for life. I was ready for the good times. And then I get saved. And everything changed. For the better. And Zechariah and Elizabeth didn't know any of this, but they remained faithful. What a wonderful, wonderful story for both of them, for all of them, for the four of them, Joseph and Mary and Zechariah and Elizabeth. It's so overwhelming. For Mary, she burst forth into praise in awe and wonder of who he is and how he does things. It's known as Mary's Magnificat. So that's the story of two wombs entwined. I hope you guys enjoyed that. But I love bringing these little stories of proper context to you. And I'm going to be doing a bunch of them over the next 3 or 4 months. So put them in a folder. Take some notes. Do a little studying when you hear these things. Hey, I'm Jim Sidor. I am your personal Bible teacher. You've been listening to the Bible Exposition channel. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sidor. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.